At some point after 60, a quiet switch flips inside some men. One day they are present, reliable, available, and then, almost without warning, they disappear. No dramatic fights, no final arguments, no long explanations, just silence. If you've ever wondered why some senior men cut everyone off and why, once they do, they rarely come back, this isn't a story about bitterness or immaturity. It's a story about accumulation. Because for most men over 60, walking away isn't impulsive, it's not reactive, and it's almost never sudden from their point of view. It's usually the final stage of a psychological journey that began decades earlier. By this age, most men have already lived several emotional lives. They've been husbands, ex-husbands, fathers, providers, workers, problem solvers. They've carried responsibility quietly and consistently. They've absorbed disappointment, betrayal, neglect, and unmet expectations without always having language for it. Unlike younger men, who often still believe effort can fix everything, older men eventually reach a different conclusion. They stop negotiating with life. They stop explaining themselves. They stop asking to be understood. And instead, they withdraw. One of the strongest psychological reasons senior men cut everyone off is emotional exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, not boredom, but burnout. After decades of being expected to be strong, dependable, emotionally contained, and endlessly available, many men realize something uncomfortable. Their emotional needs were rarely prioritized. They were valued for what they provided, not how they felt. They were needed, but not necessarily known. Over time, this creates a deep internal fatigue. By 60, some men feel they've already given enough chances, explanations, and compromises for one lifetime. So when they cut people off, it isn't about punishment, it's about preservation. Cutting people off becomes a way to conserve what little emotional energy remains, a way of saying, without words, I don't have anything left to negotiate. And this is where the outside world gets confused. From the outside, the withdrawal looks cold, sudden, even cruel, but from the inside, it often feels like relief. Because this decision didn't start at 60, it started with every time they stayed quiet instead of speaking up, every time they tolerated disrespect to keep the peace, every time they chose responsibility over self-protection. The silence at the end is just the part people finally notice. By the time many men reach their 60s, they are no longer reacting to individual moments. They are responding to patterns. Patterns of being needed but not considered, of being relied on but not supported, of being expected to stay steady while their own emotional needs remained secondary. For decades, many men were conditioned to believe that endurance was strength. They were taught to be the provider, the fixer, the one who absorbs pressure without complaint. And for a long time, they did exactly that. They stayed quiet during conflict. They swallowed disappointment. They told themselves that patience would eventually be rewarded. But emotional labor accumulates. Every unmet need leaves a residue. Every compromise that isn't reciprocated adds weight. Every moment of being ignored while still being expected to perform slowly drains the system. This is why emotional exhaustion becomes such a powerful force after 60. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't explode outward. It settles in quietly. At some point, many older men realize they are tired in a way rest cannot fix. They are tired of explaining themselves, tired of justifying boundaries, tired of negotiating respect. Younger men often believe that if they try harder, communicate better, or stay longer, things will improve. Senior men have already tested that theory. They've watched the same dynamics repeat across relationships, workplaces, and family systems. So when they disengage, it isn't because they gave up too early, it's because they stayed too long. Another psychological shift that happens around this age is the loss of illusion. Earlier in life, many men believe relationships are built on fairness and mutual effort, that loyalty will be returned, that sacrifice will be noticed, that patience will eventually be met with appreciation. By 60, Many men have seen enough to know that this isn't always how it works. They begin to recognize manipulation faster. They notice disrespect earlier. They sense emotional games almost immediately. And once the illusion of if I try harder, it will change disappears, tolerance drops sharply. When an older man cuts someone off, it rarely feels sudden to him. It feels overdue. The withdrawal only appears abrupt to the people who missed or ignored the warning signs. By this stage, the decision isn't emotional, it's logistical. It's the result of a long internal calculation that finally reached its conclusion. After 60, something fundamental shifts in how many men define themselves. They stop organizing their identity around roles. They are no longer trying to prove they are a good husband, a good father, a reliable employee, a dependable partner. They've already played those roles. They've already paid the cost. Instead, they begin defining themselves by something simpler and far less negotiable: peace. And peace has a ruthless standard. Anything that disturbs it is examined carefully. Anything that consistently threatens it is removed. This includes constant criticism, emotional instability, entitlement, disrespect masked as familiarity. There are no long debates at this stage, no dramatic confrontations, no attempts to educate others on how to treat them better, just distance. For some men, especially those who have experienced divorce, long-term emotional neglect, or repeated boundary violations, this withdrawal is also about control. For much of their lives, they felt controlled by expectations, what they should provide, how much they should tolerate, what they were expected to endure quietly. After 60, time feels different. Every year feels finite. Every hour feels more valuable. And the idea of spending that limited time managing other people's emotional chaos becomes unacceptable. Psychology shows that as people age, tolerance for emotional cost decreases, while the desire for emotional clarity increases. Senior men don't necessarily feel this shift more strongly than others. They simply act on it more decisively. Another uncomfortable realization often arrives around this age. Many senior men recognize that they were valued primarily for what they offered: money, stability, problem-solving, emotional labor. When they stop offering these things, or when they finally set boundaries, the relationship changes. Attention fades. Appreciation weakens. Demands remain. Older men notice this immediately, and unlike younger men, they don't argue about it. They leave. This is also where accumulated resentment comes into play. Senior men often carry resentment silently for years. They don't vent. They don't explode. They don't make scenes. They observe. They remember. They keep an internal ledger even if they never speak it out loud. When that ledger finally feels unbalanced beyond repair, the withdrawal is complete. To outsiders, this looks cold. Psychologically, it often feels like relief. Many senior men who cut everyone off report something surprising afterward: less anxiety, fewer arguments, more internal quiet. Not happiness, but calm. As men age, something often begins to outweigh the desire for connection: dignity. Being talked down to, being dismissed, being taken for granted. These experiences feel different after 60. Younger men may tolerate disrespect to avoid loneliness. Older men would rather be alone than feel diminished. When dignity is threatened repeatedly, the decision to disconnect becomes non-negotiable. There is also a neurological shift that plays a role. Research shows that emotional regulation tends to improve with age. Older adults are generally less reactive and more selective about where they invest emotional energy. Senior men are not emotionally numb, they are emotionally selective. They invest only where they feel respected, understood, and at peace. Everyone else slowly fades into the background. For some senior men, cutting everyone off is also tied to grief. The loss of parents, siblings, friends, spouses. After enough loss, emotional priorities change. Some men stop attaching easily. They become cautious with emotional investment. Distance begins to feel safer than disappointment. Silence feels safer than vulnerability. It's important to understand that this behavior is rarely rooted in hatred. It comes from boundaries that were learned too late. Many men wish they had learned earlier how to say no, how to leave, how to protect themselves emotionally. After 60, they finally apply those lessons, sometimes strongly, sometimes abruptly, but almost always deliberately. Another overlooked reason senior men cut people off is clarity about compatibility. They are no longer interested in potential. They don't want to wait for someone to change. They don't want to negotiate values. They don't want to manage emotional volatility. They want alignment, shared values, emotional stability, mutual respect. If those are missing, they disengage. This isn't cynicism, it's efficiency. There is also a deeper, more existential layer to this withdrawal. As men age, they think more about meaning, about legacy, about how they want to spend what remains of their time. Superficial relationships feel empty, drama feels pointless, conversations without depth feel draining. Cutting people off becomes a way of creating space for reflection, for solitude, for authenticity. From the outside, this can look like arrogance or bitterness. In reality, many senior men who withdraw are deeply reflective. They've simply reached the conclusion that fewer connections, if they are real, are better than many shallow ones. And if real connection isn't available, solitude feels preferable. When senior men cut everyone off, something unexpected often happens first. Relief. Not happiness, not excitement. Relief. The nervous system calms down. The constant anticipation of conflict disappears. There is no one to impress, no one to explain themselves to, no one to disappoint. For men who spent decades managing other people's emotions, this silence can feel intoxicating. For the first time in years, quiet feels safe instead of lonely. But that relief doesn't always stay the same. Over time, it evolves. Some men turn that quiet into strength, clarity, and purpose. Others slowly drift into emotional numbness without realizing it. This is why the psychology of cutting everyone off after 60 is complex. It can be empowering, or it can be damaging, depending on what replaces the noise. Many senior men report that once they withdraw, they rediscover parts of themselves that were buried under obligation. Hobbies return, curiosity returns. They read more, walk more, think more. Without constant external influence, their internal voice grows clearer. This is why some older men appear calmer and more grounded after they disconnect. They are no longer living in reaction mode. But there is another side that rarely gets discussed. Human beings are wired for connection, even those who value solitude. When isolation is chosen consciously, it can be healthy. When it becomes permanent avoidance, it quietly erodes emotional flexibility. Some men become so protective of their peace that they stop allowing anyone close enough to challenge or support them. Psychologically, this creates emotional rigidity. They feel stable, but unreachable. Women often struggle to understand this phase. Many interpret the withdrawal personally. Others see it as punishment. In reality, most senior men are not withdrawing from women. They are withdrawing from emotional unpredictability. They are done navigating mixed signals, power struggles, constant emotional negotiation. If someone brings calm, respect, and consistency, many older men remain open. If they bring drama, testing, or entitlement, the door closes quietly and permanently. Another important shift after 60 is how men view conflict.
Younger men often see conflict as something to solve. Older men increasingly see it as something to avoid, not out of weakness, but out of awareness. Stress affects sleep, blood pressure, heart health. Senior men understand the cost. Cutting people off becomes a health decision as much as an emotional one. There is also the issue of trust. Many senior men have trusted deeply and paid for it. Betrayal feels heavier later in life because there is less time to recover. When trust is broken after 60, many men don't rebuild it. They withdraw.
Not as revenge, as risk management. Some senior men also cut everyone off because they feel invisible. Society often stops listening to older men. Their experiences are dismissed, their emotions minimized. Over time, some men stop offering themselves to a world that no longer seems interested. Silence becomes a response to invisibility. Yet many of these men still crave connection, just on very specific terms. Depth without chaos, honesty without manipulation, companionship without control. If those conditions aren't met, solitude feels preferable. This selective openness is often mistaken for coldness. In reality, it's discernment sharpened by decades of experience. One of the most important psychological truths is this: senior men do not cut everyone off because they don't care. They cut everyone off because they finally care about themselves. The healthiest senior men don't cut off everyone. They cut off the wrong people. They keep one or two connections that offer warmth, honesty, and mutual respect. They protect their peace without building walls so high that nothing can enter. They learn that boundaries don't require disappearance. Distance doesn't require silence. And solitude doesn't require bitterness. So the deeper question isn't whether cutting everyone off was right or wrong. The question is, what are you building in the quiet? Peace is powerful, but it must be lived, not just protected. Solitude can heal, but only if it's chosen consciously, not used as armor. Awareness is the difference between strength and stagnation. And sometimes the most mature form of connection begins